Okay, well, thank you, Dave, and also thanks to everyone over at Clear for hosting this webinar and giving me a chance to share the Stormwise program, our initiative, and what's going on, the many facets of this initiative. So in Connecticut, we have very much a problem with consistent electricity, and that problem is due primarily to trees falling on power lines. And so if trees are very strong and they don't fail, we would have far less trouble with our electricity. And the figures that have come out of the last few storms, show that 90% of our power outages, 80 to 90, probably up to 90, are due to trees. They're somehow tree related. So if we can do something about making the trees more wind firm, we could go a long way in getting more consistent power. But that is a very complex problem, and it is a problem that has to be addressed from multiple facets, if you will. Particularly, and these facets really come from the idea of sustainability and a sustainable approach. And you have to address the biophysical, the economic, and the social facets of the problem to really come up with an achievable, a doable, practical solution. And that's what we've done with Stormwise. And three of the driving questions under each of these three headings are: one, under the biophysical, how can we create tree storm resilience, and how long will that take for acclimation to occur to wind? The economic side of this, what will it cost to implement these things? How do we pay for that? Are there ways that we can offset the costs of these things? And finally, the social aspect of it, certainly not the least of these, is how will we gain public acceptance and adoption of managing for resilience? Many of these trees we're talking about small private land holdings. And so we really need maybe not a legislative solution, but a broad adoption of this program. And so it has to be really developed in concert with the public. So I'd like to start really the talk with, when we start talking about the biophysical side of things, we really want to know, we have to understand a little bit about how trees grow and what makes some trees more wind firm or more resistant to storm damage. And science research has shown us that mechanical stability of trees is largely related to prolonged wind exposure. So we see this over and over again. This is an open-grown tree near the UConn campus, or just actually this is on the UConn forest, or edge of the forest. And we see that these open-grown trees usually survive the really intense windstorms, and that's because they've been experiencing wind their whole lives. And so they're really well acclimated. And it's not just their structure, but it's also the anatomy of the wood as well. Now, this acclimation to wind, I certainly can't claim to be the first one to observe this or notice this. It's been known for at least a couple of thousand years. The father of botany, Theophrastus, noticed this on the coast of Greece, and he saw that, and he noticed that trees growing in very windy environments were very different. The wood was denser, the trees were different shapes, and that's the basic idea. And lots of research since then, more formalized experiments going way back to 1803, Sir Thomas Knight, looking at this phenomena and experimenting it and looking at how tethering a tree, preventing its wind loading or its intercepting wind loads, the trees grew skinny and tall. And trees, and by the opposite, trees that you induce bending or you make them bend more tend to grow short and fat and changes their wood properties as well. And this has been shown for every species that has been tested pretty much all plants that we know of do this. They grow shorter, fatter, and stronger when you apply more force to them, more bending stimulation. And that's really what the wind does. And so if we were to summarize all of the changes that happen to a tree, it changes the wood anatomy, increases the flexibility, or a major component that determines flexibility is the microfibril angle, or the MFA, wood density, tracheids. And so I don't need to read every one of these, but you can see there's a whole host of changes that happen when a tree intercepts or is experiencing mechanical loading. So trees growing in the open and trees growing in a dense forest stand grow very differently. And one of the big reasons why is trees growing in a closely packed forest, the trees are sheltering each other from the wind forces and actually colliding into each other, preventing those experiencing of those mechanical forces. So it has a big effect on how the wood properties and all the things we've sort of just mentioned. So, and this happens, trees growing in a group kind of depend on each other as a group. And trees growing all alone depend on themselves. And so this is kind of the idea that we capitalized in coming up with a prescription or a management approach to create more wind-resilient trees. So right now, you're looking at a photo of a tree, a hickory tree that's come over under the power lines that is well beyond the management, the right-of-way of the utility companies and of the municipalities. This tree is probably 40, 50 feet away from the road, and yet we have trees 80 to 100 feet tall, and so it's still well within striking distance of the power lines. And so the idea is that we need to manage all the trees capable of hitting the power lines. So that means considering the whole width of about one tree height, or in Connecticut, that's typically 80 to 100 feet in from the power line. And this gives us two major advantages. And one is starts building wind acclimation. So we thin out, we pick the trees that we really think are going to be the most successful and enhance their growth, help them acclimate. So we thin out, we remove some of the neighbors that are maybe decayed, have poor structure, and it allows those remaining trees to intercept more wind and have their growth respond accordingly and become more wind firm. Also, another big advantage is that light, when you open it up, light will be on all sides of the crown. It will grow symmetrically and not always directly back over the power lines or the roads, which is usually the only light available. So to give you a sense or a bit of a schematic on how this looks, we've got a bit of a cartoon here. So here's our typical situation, trees in conflict with power lines. And then we might prune around the power line, and usually there's some specs according, every utility has a little bit different, but they're usually certain height from the power line and distance in. But that approach, that pruning, doesn't affect any of the interior conditions of the forest. More recently, we've had another approach, a little more aggressive, ETT, or enhanced tree trimming, that is doing more ground to sky, 8 feet away from the power line in Connecticut. But that still leaves us with a regrowth because you didn't, one, the only light available still over the power line, and you didn't change the structure of the forest. And so the trees inside are still probably just as slender. In enhanced tree trimming, you probably get more than 5 years. You might get up to 7, but you still, it's a fairly short rotation. So here's a schematic of going in, selecting for the trees that are the best form, and removing those around it, and letting those trees grow. And this is perhaps what we would see 10, 20 years down the line, is much bigger crowns and trees with a lot more taper, or fatter trees that are much more stable. And we think the rotation on this might be, in terms of going back and having to remanage, probably anywhere from, depending on the forest, could be over 20 years, maybe 25 years. So the next part of the talk is looking at, well, how long does it take after you thin that forest for the trees to start building wind resistance or acclimating to the new wind regime? And this research is really being, Jenna Klinck has been working on this for the last couple of years, and Amanda Bunce is taking over this summer and continuing the research. So it really is, the research really looks at how trees sway. And just to give you a quick schematic, what we're talking about, we really need to understand the sway dynamics. So here's one back and forth sway, and so we have instrumentation that actually measures that, how much the tree sways very precisely in the wind. So here's a look at some of the hardware that we put in the treetops, or the students are putting in the treetops, and they are biaxial clinometers that measure the lean of the tree very precisely in both X and Y coordinates. And we have 13 of these trees being monitored at a rate of, we're collecting data 10 times a second, so we get a very good understanding of where they spend all of their time and how fast, and all their dynamic characteristics. We measure the wind as well at two towers. And here's a little bit of what the output looks like. So we get displacement, how far the trees are leaning in meters. This tree is, when the wind picked up, you can see the top right, the top graph is showing how far the tree is leaning in meters, and so it's leaning about almost a half a meter out in the wind, back and forth. And we can also, from that data, also compute the frequency of motion. So how many times does it move back and forth in a second? So trees typically are moving at around 0.2 to 0.4 hertz. Another thing that we can do by knowing where the tree is all the time is actually plot that density of the points. So the graph, or the plot on the left, has several 100,000 points, that when we plot that density contour map, we get an interesting shape of where exactly and how the tree is moving, not just its rate. And if we look at all the trees here all together, we can see that every tree has a unique pattern. Now those unique patterns, we're going to keep monitoring those over several years and see how they change after we treat this forest with a Stormwise thinning, and to see, and this will allow us to monitor how fast the forest is recovering and becoming more wind resilient. So we began collecting data in the fall of 2012. The sway data, we collected that for an entire year. We thinned it in September 2013. And then we have quite a bit of removals. And here's a map I'll show you. This stem map shows where all the trees' base positions are and their approximate crown diameters. And this next slide shows after the removals. So it's a fairly heavy thinning intended to release those edge trees and those trees that we selected that we thought would be the most wind firm going into the future, and a lot of trees that we thought had the best potential. We chose a variety of species and sizes to see how different trees would respond to the increased wind flows. And the very top, you can see some of these circles. We have some control trees as well in an area that was not thinned to make sure that to see that they don't change. So we have to have a control as well. So some preliminary results. This is really just still leaf off, looking at one of our trees, a year of monitoring, and it's doing pretty much what we expect. No change yet because it only had one growing season, or we thinned during that one growing season, so it's just starting to perceive those new forces, and this is also a pretty large hickory, so we think it's going to take a little time perhaps for this tree, but at least in the next couple of years we hope to see some changes. So what we're expecting, so the sway frequency is 0.22 for both 2 different years, but we expect that as the years go by, that sway frequency will start to increase. And that's because the tree should become more wind resilient, should become start putting diameter on, and the wood property should start to change, and we should be able to see that, and the root systems should shift as well, become stronger. So we should see that monitoring the whole tree and their dynamics. Also, the sway contours should become smaller, more compact, and we'll see some of those before and after the thinning and how that changes over the years as well. So that's certain, and those experiments actually, going back to this slide really quick, that site is on the UConn forest. This summer, Amanda Bunce is they've already installed one. We've installed one at the Torrington campus on the forest edge there, and we're also about to install a third one on a coastal site in Orange, Connecticut. So we'll have 3 different areas and 3 different sort of zones in Connecticut, so we can really start to understand how this works. So the economic part is the next section of the talk, and that when we talk about we want to remove these trees to make the remaining trees more wind firm, that's going to be potentially quite a few trees. And how do you do that? You have to use some techniques from arboriculture and silviculture and forest management, creating value. And this part is really led by Tom Wordley and student Francis and our technician Mike Hine. So we have a couple of demonstration sites that I can present some results to you. This is that same site that we're monitoring some of the sway trees in, but it's also the site of an extended sort of operational scale treatment where we've thinned out and put in the Stormwise treatment, this whole length, 440 feet long, 100 feet deep, approximately 1 acre. And what are the challenges, and how do you make that implementing in such a small, narrow strip cost effective? Well, the removals were done with very small scale, you might say micro scale logging. It isn't cost effective to bring in full scale logging equipment, and ours was done literally with that John Deere Gator and that logging arch, dragging them out to the road for log buyers could come right to the site. So some of the logs were sold outright, and some of the logs were milled on site for a really important part of trying to add value to the removals. We can see Tenant Tree was our contractor who worked with us to remove or to fell the trees that were too close to the power lines. We actually had students dropping the trees a little bit deeper in, or that were safe, that were leaning the right way, but Tenant Tree came in, and that was part of work that we had to do was teach them how to create valuable logs from the trees instead of just cutting them up into 3-foot pieces, which are close to use or close to you lose tremendous or most of the value cutting them up so small. And exactly how do you get the highest value log out of a particular tree? And you can increase the value tremendously. So that's a really important aspect to this. So small-scale harvesting, so here are some of the economic numbers on this. 1 acre cost, some of the student work, but also the biggest cost here was the arborists, as you might imagine. Bucket trucks and professional arborists are not cheap. And that cost about $6,600 for that 1 acre. And then we have a variety of outputs or a suite of products: high-grade logs, low-grade logs, fuel wood, core wood, fuel wood and perhaps and our sawn material as well. And that value, and we added up the cost, all the hours it took to saw that material. And we tried to be as accurate as possible of all the costs. And so we're coming close to breaking even on implementing that treatment. Our other demonstration site was a large scale or larger scale, about 10 acres, also on UConn forest. And so the Stormwise treatment was put in, but also the remaining of the forest was harvested, was thinned out according to another prescription, but Stormwise treatment was just put on that first 100 feet. Still, the biggest cost was an arborist, about $7,200 for that job, but with a larger property, you could bring in large-scale forestry equipment, sort of normal-scale filler bunchers and things, and you could much more easily pay for the operation without even having to use a portable sawmill to add value to boards. In both operations, we had student help, and sometimes it's hard to estimate student the cost, but we think that students might add 10 to 20% of that to the costs. And here's what that resulting edge looked like. Now you're looking at it now. The resulting edge, so you can see our edge trees with some blue sky behind them. And we're hoping that these trees will take us into the future and be more wind firm. Finally, we have our social aspect to this. How will we gain public acceptance of Stormwise, this initiative, and get people to adopt managing for resilience? So our first big effort is, or our concept is, to foster Stormwise communities. This really should be perhaps thought of as a community level effort, and the aspects to develop these communities are really public engagement, extension education, and some social science research that we've started to undertake. But if I could sum that all up in one word, it is communicate. Communicate Stormwise, communicate with the people, and move and develop the program. For every community, it's going to be different. The big part of communication is web-based, so we have a pretty good website now. Social media, Facebook, and of course, I think a really powerful social media that I've been more engaged with is our Twitter account. And this really ties well into an outreach event that we had earlier this summer. This was the Great Park Pursuit that is put on by, or is hosted by DEEP. And this year that they had their grand finale at the UConn campus, and we hooked up a way for them to pull on a tree that was censored And so they could actually, the families could pull, and the contest was to see how big of a wind load they could apply as a family. And so it really was a wonderful way to engage and get people thinking about wind and trees and this program. Our state forester stopped by, and he couldn't even resist. Our urban foresters in the background there, Chris Donnelly, and of course Chris Martin in the foreground, pulling not quite hurricane force, but fairly close, I think. So engaging, part of our communication is engaging stakeholders, policymakers. Here's Tom Worthley speaking with Governor Malloy about Stormwise, about the concepts. And I think another big part of getting this out to the public is rethinking tree cutting and presenting this whole initiative and communicating all the parts of it together and showing people that we can, in fact, the removals that come off of your property can be made into something beautiful, can be produced locally and consumed locally. Instead of getting our hardwoods, we have wonderful hardwood forest and lumber. We don't, and so not importing everything, say, from third world countries. So these demonstration areas are also our operational treatments, our demonstration areas, and we do a lot of tours in them, and we're happy to do a lot more. But we're also moving and putting a lot of these demonstrations areas in, and we've established this is still just finishing sort of putting this together, but this is our mobile logging and outreach trailer that we can take to a site and start implementing Stormwise and communicating it. This summer we are actively at the Nathan Hale State Forest. We are putting in a Stormwise treatment there, and we will be bringing milling wood at the Coventry Farmers Market and showing value-added products and selling value-added products there. And we think that the Coventry Farmers Market, the Farmers Market community is probably already quite receptive to locally grown, locally consumed Connecticut products. And so that's probably we think it's a good place to start. Big efforts like this have to have lots of collaborators, and we have many wonderful collaborators in this program, and a lot of people are getting on board and helping us, and it's really quite picking up steam, we think. Now I'd like to talk about some of the other, continuing on this communication part and the social science and understanding and getting a very accurate understanding of people's perceptions and attitudes towards trees, utilities, pruning, thinning, everything around this area. We're developing a social science survey so we can have a very good basis to gather this information, and our main areas that we're trying to understand about people's attitudes and beliefs about trees, outages, connections between trees and outages, and tree management. Because we do think there's a relationship between people's opinions, their experiences, and their understanding of underlying risk. We want to use this survey, the purpose of the survey and the use of it is to inform management objectives, improve our ability to develop acceptable yet still have to be effective solutions, and enhance our education and outreach efforts. And we really need it as well to form a baseline of how things are going over time. So speaking of people's perceptions of risk, I think this is a really crucial question that we are also doing some research on, is what is our current level of risk? And to do that, we are using some, I think, the cutting edge technology of using LIDAR-based remote sensing to assess tree structure and tree structure adjacent to power lines. So we're using LIDAR, which is light detection and ranging, and it gives us three-dimensional points that you can see in that bottom figure to reconstruct tree crowns in the cloud that we can then reconstruct trees and their size and their shape and the ground. So it gives us a very detailed view of what's going on. So first this is still in a research phase, so we need to know what is the ability of the LIDAR to accurately estimate all of these things. And the second one is to, from that, determine what information can improve damage prediction. When the next storm comes, what kind of damage can we expect? So very briefly about LIDAR. It's an airborne sensor that measures at a very high resolution everything on the ground. It gives us a 3D picture, and it's detailed enough to give us even where the cross arms, and sometimes it even picks up the actual wires of the power lines. And of course it gives us the terrain. So here's a quick example of a point cloud, and illustrated there we can actually see the utility pole and where the trim zone has been in the past and where the road is. So we can actually look at that for the whole state. When I mean the whole state, not quite the whole state. We have LIDAR coverage for about 75% of the state right now. Most of it is quite recent, after 2010. And we can look at, well, what we're going to do is then use that to identify the potential hazard. So if there's trees that are very tall and very close to power lines, then they pose a hazard. And if you're close to a power line, then you're a higher risk. And depending on if the power line is a backbone or a non-backbone, that risk level is adjusted. And so since we can't quite delineate, especially in deciduous trees, it's quite difficult. We can't delineate all the crowns. We have to convert these things to some pixels. And so tall trees, dense trees next to power lines convert, and so and a backbone power line, for instance, might get a very high hazard rating. And then we can project that. This projection of pixels is for the eastern third of Connecticut. Some other things that we know affect, or we suspect affect hazard, is how dense the vegetation is, and we can take that into account and adjust pixels. And we can also take into account topography and wetland soils. And so this is ongoing research, but we expect in the next year or two this is going to really be a powerful tool. And so but the main tool that, and that is tells us where the vulnerability is. And this last part of my talk really talks about the efforts that are going on by our colleagues in the UConn School of Engineering, and their sort of real-time damage prediction model for a given storm that approaches the state. And that is led by Manos Anagnostou and joined by Marina and Brian Hartman. And so it is primarily, well, has a couple of components: of weather forecasting modeling, damage prediction modeling, and uncertain, and you have to know the level of uncertainty for any given prediction. So the reason this model is very important is, as a storm is coming, an impending storm, and depending on the size and severity, the utility needs to know how many resources and where they need to have and where to send those resources. So this is a very important model for them as well. And it tells us about what are our vulnerabilities and helps guide mitigation and hardening of the infrastructure. Very briefly, I only have a couple more slides here, very briefly about the model and how it's developed. They took historical storm cases, about 120 storm events, and looked at the outage and came up with a relationship. And then they project the new storm and look at the past behavior and predict. So it's a very empirical model. And that's the challenge, coupling with the LIDAR information as we move forward to get the model to be, and we're working closely with engineering to get the model to be more mechanistic in nature so it's more accurate. Speaking of the accuracy, here's some sample events predicted with the damage prediction model. And the closer UI, the closer the point is to the one-to-one line, that diagonal line going across the graph, the better the prediction. So if you're right on the line like Irene, you got it right on. You can see some of the storms, the smaller the storm, the thunderstorms in particular are very difficult to predict. The larger, wide-ranging hurricanes, tropical storms, I should say, are more accurate. Here's some results from Tropical Storm Sandy. That was 36 hours in advance, 24, and then the bottom picture of Connecticut shows all the towns with actual damages reporting. So spatially, it's pretty good. It's got the hotspots, and overall numbers were good for this particular storm. So some acknowledgments. Whoa. That went surprisingly quick. I thought that would take longer, but acknowledgments: Connecticut Light and Power, United Illuminating, and State and Private Forestry, Northeastern Area Competitive Allocation, and the Stores Agricultural Experiment Station, McIntyre Stennis Forestry Grant. So that is, I think I hear Dave. So that is, and I'd be the conclusion really. I'll leave it with this slide, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. Great presentation. There are a couple questions that have come in. I encourage other folks use the question box that's on your GoToWebinar tool panel to enter in additional questions for Mark. That's sort of the most efficient way to do that in this format. But I'll start with a couple questions that we've got in, Mark, if you want to respond. The first one is, in terms of your cost estimates for doing kind of a Stormwise treatment on an area, did that include the cost for stump removal?
No. These removals were not in urban areas, if you will. These are really more outlying, what we call ex-urban or rural. And so stump removals were not done, or we don't, yeah, so no, that was not included at all.
Okay. A couple of people have asked about downloading the presentation. We did record the webinar, and so you can watch it back, and I'll talk with Mark and see if there's a way we can post a PDF of the presentation for folks who are interested as well. Sure. There's also a question here. I think you addressed it a little bit when you were talking about the upcoming LIDAR studies. But the question is there any kind of sonar, or can sonar be adapted to scan trees for their resiliency, i.e. show weak spots and branches that should be removed/pruned? One would think a healthy tree would scan solid, and perhaps one not so healthy might show areas where water doesn't get through its systems. Or is root system integrity more important?
Oh. Well, it's only as strong as its weakest link, right? So, but in terms of detecting decay, there are some sonic techniques. That is true. They are expensive. You need to basically hire a consultant or somebody who knows how to use that equipment. But there's a few ways to detect how big your decay cavity is. Right? There's resistive drilling is probably the cheaper way to go, and then there's the full-blown sonic tomograph, and those are quite good at showing exactly how much good solid wood you have and how bad the tree is. Right? So there's a few tests, but if you're very concerned about an individual tree, right, because they tend to be expensive, so
okay.
it's hard to do or impossible to do for a large number of trees. Right?
The next question is, are there any urban applications for Stormwise?
That is something that we're definitely very much working on, or you might even say preoccupied with. You know, because in urban areas, the premise behind Stormwise is, oh, we're going to thin the trees out, and then the remaining trees will become more wind firm. Well, in the urban environment, those trees are already well spaced, and the challenges in the urban environment tend to be rooting problems usually, or decay. And so thinning that's not a technique that you're going to really be successful with. So, but still, damage tree risk assessment, we think that this is one idea that I've been working on, is coming up with an app, a mobile phone app, to get people to engage in the process of assessing the risk of their own trees and understanding, is my tree really, should I be concerned enough to call a professional for a full-blown assessment? Because there are ways to do a sort of back of the envelope rough assessment of your tree risk, and we think that sort of assessment or crowdsourcing might go a long way in getting people to engage and understand that trees, we need to manage the trees. We want healthy trees. They're far less likely to fall on power lines and everything else if we keep them healthy and manage them. And some of them need to be removed, but of course replanted. But right tree in the right place is also very crucial.
Okay, and this next one gets to the sort of enhanced tree trimming program that you mentioned early on. How do you see Stormwise tying in with the enhanced tree trimming program, or do you see it tying in with the enhanced tree trimming program already poised to be implemented?
Well, yes, it definitely can. I think where you would put in Stormwise, we would prefer, I think, if it was put in, say, at the same time, because when you're going into an edge, you might engage in some pruning to prune back some trees, but other trees might be removed completely, and so pruning them is sort of a waste in time and effort if it's going to be removed anyways, right?
Right.
And so it would make sense to do it at the same time, right? And I think that'd be the best. But you could still do it afterwards. But yeah.
Okay. A lot more questions coming in now. It says, I realize, so we'll try to get through them quickly. I realize that you are studying power line corridors, but when we move into town and city settings, many of the trees that need to be removed are on private property. Is there any discussion around this?
Oh, we think it's almost all private property. You know, none of this, there's almost no right-of-ways, even in these outlying areas. We are starting and putting in these demonstrations on state land, on UConn land, but that is just to demonstrate and show it. But even in most of Connecticut, it's going to work. It's all going to be on private lands, almost primarily. So it has to be a buy-in and an adoption by the public. I don't think we're going to legislate any such thing here.
Next question gets to the sort of idea of using the wood afterwards, and it says, are there plans to work with the utilities to do the recovery of lumber that is removed regardless of site, i.e. in more suburban and urban areas?
Yes, and in fact we're talking with the utilities now about how we organize that, and we have identified some pilot towns that, if this is really early, so I can't really mention that, but that will come out, I think, very soon, and that is exactly what we're doing. The plan is to have a centralized location in each town and get the municipality or the town involved, and staging areas for wood products, and some of the profits would possibly go to the homeowner or to the town's tree management budget. Yeah. So we think that that's very viable, and we're definitely working on these things.
Okay, and this gets to the economics. It says, what is the projected financial feasibility of this management technique in the long term, especially as many of the trees will belong to towns or private property owners? So I guess, you know, as you pointed out, it seems to be that selling the lumber is pretty much paying for the cost, but I think this is more geared towards where does the money go based on who owns the trees and who's paying for the removal.
Right, and that has to be kind of worked out, but you have to pay the arborist's time, and you have to pay the workers have to be paid to do the work, right? But roughly speaking, that leaves the 20 to 30% of the value may be available to either the homeowner or the town, depending on who the tree owner is the rough numbers right now. But it really is going to depend on the value of the tree, because some logs are worth far more than others. If it's a high value character log, yeah, so we'll see where those numbers go. And if it gets cut up into boards, right, you could really be talking quite a bit of profit, and that might go to the town, whoever's cutting it up.
Okay, and I think we have addressed this, but I'll just throw it out there in case you have more to add. Someone asked, could this be offered as a replacement or partial replacement for the enhanced roadside tree trimming?
Yes, I think we touched on it, but yes, I think this would definitely be a replacement of, and that's the intent. Was you wouldn't have to, some trees wouldn't have to be pruned maybe so far back, but you wouldn't keep all the trees either. So it would be you would be restructuring the forest, but not just pruning it back. So it's a very different approach.
Okay. Next question is wondering how the utility companies are involved in this effort. The person said that they think that utility companies would be willing to pay for this service, but just didn't know how or if they are involved in Stormwise.
Well, they are involved. We are working with them. They're going to be a very crucial partner to make sure, you know, if they're already paying utility arborists to come and prune, well, then a lot of those costs, you know, are already being spent, right? You already have an arborist crew out there, and if we could spend a little more time instead of just pruning, but doing Stormwise treatments, right, and then using those profits to go back into the town or to the homeowner. The utility companies are very, very interested in this model and are going down this road with us right now.
Okay.
They're certainly not interested in any of the profits, but they, you know, but they are very interested in helping. Say maybe that money could go into replanting or better management. Right.
Oh, interesting. This question is, have you looked at calculating the cost savings of not having to clean up debris, repairing sidewalks, and dealing with power outages, and folding that into sort of your economic estimate?
Right. That's a great question. That's a huge economic piece that we have not done yet, but it is an obvious one, I think. Well, maybe not too obvious, but it's a big one, and we think that's one of the reasons why we think the utility is very interested in Stormwise, because not only do you probably get mitigation of outage, but you also get, hopefully and probably, far less cleanup costs. The power gets on faster, and yes, the economic impacts are far less. That's the idea behind it, right? If it's widely adopted, but it really has to be widely adopted, right? It has to sort of be adopted at the community level. We can't have, you know, say half the community engaging and expect to see all the benefits. So it has to be sort of a grassroots community level to get homeowners to sort of band together and say, look, if everyone on the circuit, our power circuit, does this, maybe we're going to have more reliable power. and probably will. But so it has to be broadly adopted to work.
And I'm just a note for everybody. We have 4 minutes left before the 3 o'clock hour. There's nothing magical about the 3 o'clock hour from our standpoint. The webinar will still be going, so you're welcome to stay on as long as you want past then. We still have about 10 questions so far still to go through, and we'll stay and answer all of those as long as you all are interested in staying. So stay or leave as you need to. But this next question is, because we will be removing and trimming so many trees with the new ETT/ETR program, is there advice on what species or how to plant in the suburban-urban environment? I assume that means after removal or something?
Yeah, so I think there are species lists already out there in terms of what the right tree in the right place are, right? These have been formulated by a few people years ago in Connecticut, in New England, right? So those lists are out there. But the hard part is, I think, how do we change the structure to then allow for the opportunity to put the right tree in the right place, not in a storm. The storms will do it for us, but I think if we do it and get ready, we'll be a lot better off.
Next one is, while it may be a ways off, what kind of buy-in do you think will be needed in order to sell this technique to towns and property owners? It says you kind of shied away from a legislative fix in the beginning of the talk, but how can we really avoid this if the fix is to be comprehensively effective?
Well, I think there's some key legislative things that could help, like, you know, if each town would establish a staging area for wood products that are coming off these sites, whether they are chips or in facilitating and being a partner in this, or whole logs, or setting up an area for a solar kiln for people that are cutting up boards, right? So towns can be really integral in the success of this. What was that first part of that question?
What kind of buy-in do you think will be needed in order to sell this technique to towns and property owners?
Well, I think the towns and the managers, the emergency managers, are looking for any kind of solution to help mitigate the next storm, the damage from the next storm. I don't think that that's too difficult. The difficult is how do you pay for it, right? Because this is not going to be free, and towns typically have little or no money for such things. And so the ability to offset these costs is going to be key for the towns to want to adopt, but also the private homeowners, for them to adopt. I think that is something we're still learning. Social science, again, social question, but if they can see a benefit and the forest is taken care of and it's still beautiful, I think we can get adoption.
Okay. Another question about power company involvement. Okay, this one is wondering how thick, or I think really what they mean is how deep should the area of forest be for consideration of implementing the Stormwise program? Or is that a factor?
Well, I think it has to. You have to consider all the trees within striking distance of the power line, right? That's pretty crucial, right? And you have to assess every one of them, really, and the future too. You have to look at the trees that are shorter and what species are they, right? Some species are probably less desirable that are in the understory, and we probably would want to select against those. One obvious one that comes to mind is ash. We know that the emerald ash borer is coming in. It is in already several counties in Connecticut, and it's only a matter of time, 10, 15 years, before we really start losing all of our ash trees large scale. And so moving now to remove ash preemptively is probably a very good idea.
This may be a little outside the scope, but have there been any recommendations to manage the utility lines to reduce tree versus utility conflict, such as burying or relocating utility lines?
Well, I think the utilities have looked at burying, and I don't think it would be very expensive.
Right.
And the figure I have heard was a tripling or quadrupling of the current utility, what the rates are to do that. Now, I'm not going to stand by that number. That's not a hard number. That's just something I've heard. But I know it would be very expensive. And for high-density population areas, that might be feasible. But in the more outlying areas in many towns in Connecticut, that is just not going to be affordable.
Okay, and the next one is, if the private trees are the ones that need to come down, how do you incentivize the contractors to help the homeowner break even?
Well, certainly we wouldn't put any, there's no cost to the homeowner, and in fact the homeowner might profit, right?
Okay.
Depending on the value of the trees that were moved from their property, right? And so it would vary depending on your trees. So, okay. Yeah.
And this final question is, what role would tree wardens play in Stormwise?
Well, that's a great question. I think, that's something that I haven't engaged directly with tree wardens, but they're going to be, of course, really crucial because they're a big legally they're crucial in the state. So every tree has to basically has to go through them for approvals, and so this could be plans, proposed thinnings, proposed removals might well have to be approved by the tree warden before anything is done, right? And so we'll see how that sort of plays out, but I expect the tree warden is going to be a central figure, a central character in how this goes.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark. That's all the questions that we have at this point. Thanks for going through all of them. There's quite a few. And I want to thank everybody for tuning into the webinar today. Once again, we did record the webinar, and I'll be processing that video over the next couple of days and posting that on our website, clear.uconn.edu, so you can watch it again there. Mark has already said that he's willing to post his PowerPoint on our website as well, so we'll post that next to the video. And there's also a link on our webinar page for this webinar to Mark's email address, whether he likes it or not, so you can follow up with him on your own to ask him more questions about the Stormwise program. So Mark, unless you have any closing thoughts?
No, that was great. Good questions, and that was a great, thanks for the opportunity, Dave.
Yep. Thank you, and have a great day, everybody.